Thanks for coming, everybody. This is the user orientation for everybody that works up on Maunakea, required by the Board of Land and Natural Resources. Just a note, the way we spell Maunakea is sometimes a little different, as one word rather than two words. The background is the state of Hawaii, like every other state, has a board on geographic place names. In Hawaii, that's representatives from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, the Hawaiian Language College, I think it's the NOAA that primarily represents it, a couple other entities, and they determine appropriate place name spellings for all place names in the state. And we are required to use those place names, and we do with the exception of the spelling of Maunakea, and that is by request of a cultural advisory committee that we have, Kahukumana, as well as the UH Hilo Hawaiian Language Office. The way it's been explained to me, I'm not a Hawaiian language expert by any stretch of the imagination or speaker, but the way it's been explained to me, in Hawaiian, one word is, when you compress it into one word, it is a place-specific reference. So Maunakea as one word is a site-specific reference. As two words, it's a generic reference, the common interpretation, Mauna being mountain, Kea being white, is one of the more common. But it's a mountain that is white, any mountain that is white. Whereas when you compress it into one word, it is a place-specific reference. So all the other place names, pu'us generally there are exceptions in Hawaiian, just like there are in almost any other language. But you'll see the spellings of pu'u waiau all as one word. That is the official state recognized spelling. It's just Maunakea where we differ. So with that, we'll get started. So thanks for coming, everybody. This is, again, the user orientation for everyone working up on Maunakea. The Office of Maunakea Management is really guided by something called the Maunakea Comprehensive Management Plan. It covers all the University of Hawaii managed areas, and it was approved by the Board of Land and Natural Resources and the University Board of Regents back in 2009. It does a number of things, and we'll cover them throughout this orientation. To start with, it reiterated that there were a couple of different entities that guide our management and oversee our management. And that's, more specifically, that's something called the Kahukumana Council, a group of Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners. They're volunteers from the community that advise our office and the Maunakea Management Board and the University Chancellor on policies, practices, and sort of cultural activities on the mountain. There's also the Maunakea Management Board, another volunteer community group that oversees and approves of the policies and practices that we have, reviews and makes recommendations for larger projects, larger construction projects, and things that sort of meet a certain set of criteria that are outlined in the 2000 master plan. But essentially, this comprehensive management plan is the state's guidance to the university for how we are to function and manage the land on Maunakea. So that's really what this is about, is what the state is saying we need to do as part of a management plan for operating observatories and being responsible for as land managers on Maunakea. The Comprehensive Management Plan, or CMP as we'll refer to it today, has 4 subplans: a public access plan, a decommissioning plan, a natural resource management plan, and a cultural resource management plan. And we'll go through many of the different aspects of this throughout the orientation here. And it spells out, as the 4 subplans imply, spells out all kinds of different things about how we're supposed to approach management and what's required of the university and anyone working or visiting up on the mountain. Among other things, it requires this orientation of everyone. When it comes to what do we mean, or who are you referring to when we talk about university management, the primary public face is this group of folks, the ranger staff. At present, if I'm not mistaken, they have 11 individuals on staff, men and women that mostly have a fire, ambulance, or police background. Their primary function is to help protect the resources, and really what they end up spending a lot of their time on to accomplish that is working with the visitors to make sure that they know how to safely operate vehicles, that everyone's being safe, and following some basic behavioral and etiquette standards. University management also includes road maintenance And facility maintenance, we have an easement for the gravel portion of the road between Halepohaku and the Maunakea Science Reserve that requires that we maintain it in good working order, and can only close that for maintenance and safety reasons. We operate, the university management also operates the mid-level support facilities and the visitor information station. But the real purpose of this photograph is just to emphasize that we also operate the only snow removal equipment in the state of Hawaii. There's no one else that has a spare snowplow or spare rotary snowblower parts in the state. So when it does snow, it's this group of folks is needs to be entirely self-sufficient, and sometimes it just takes a little while to get the road back up and running again, and safe for the public. University management also includes visitor services, both the visitor information station at Halepohaku. As you can see in the upper right photograph there, they operate the visitor services there. They have a free stargazing program, weather permitting, every night of the year. It's pretty amazing and very popular program. We also oversee commercial tour operations. Commercial tour companies are supposed to get a permit, and 20% of the revenue that comes into our office from the fee structure that's established as part of the permits goes to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. The rest goes back into supporting the ranger program and things like the road maintenance and other visitor services. In terms of where we're talking about with university management on Maunakea, it's really the areas outlined in blue on this map, and this is just sort of a larger overall context to point out where things are at. The main point of this is we're surrounded by various state lands. There's the Maunakea Forest Reserve around Halepohaku and along the road corridor. There's the Maunakea Ice Age Natural Area Reserve. Both of those are managed and operated by the Division of Forestry and Wildlife Office based out of Hilo. And then university managed lands includes the Halepohaku parcel, the road corridor, and the bulk of the area is actually the Maunakea Science Reserve. So really, emphasizing that the land the university manages is not that larger area at Halepohaku. It's just at Halepohaku, it's just the buildings that we have there and the land that they sit on. Everything really on the other side of the road, or if you get away from the buildings, is part of the forest reserve. And university management doesn't kick in until you're up basically along the paved road in the alpine desert habitat. Same general point here with this map, a slightly different perspective, sort of better showing the scale of areas that we manage relative to the natural area reserve. All the area in the darker gray surrounding the lighter stuff is part of the Maunakea Forest Reserve. Halepohaku is really no larger than the buildings that it sits on. The 400-yard management corridor around that stretch of road, technically that's part of the Maunakea Forest Reserve. Just we have been tasked with doing some monitoring and management in that area to just mitigate some of the effects of having the fact that there's a road there. And then the bulk of the university managed areas is in the Science Reserve. But the other main point of this map is just to emphasize that all the land shown, whether it's university managed, natural area reserve, or forest reserve, is in the state's land use district defined as conservation. And the rules for what's required in terms of when you need a permit, what types of activities are allowed or not allowed, are essentially the same between the Ice Age Natural Area Reserve, the Forest Reserve, and the Maunakea Science Reserve, at least when it comes to the conservation district rules. That each of those different management entities have their own sets of administrative rules on how they approve permits or whatnot. But in terms of building structures, what types of activities are appropriate in conservation district lands, it's the same regardless of who manages any of these parcels that are shown on this map. It's just that the university managed portion, it has a much higher profile than the other two. There's also no vegetation to hide anything that happens up there. And so there's a lot greater scrutiny. One more map of areas here, just of the astronomy precinct. All but one of the existing telescopes is in the astronomy precinct. The ones that's not is the Very Long Baseline Array, or VLBA, that's sort of below and a little bit to the right of the OMKM logo in the lower right of the photograph. The 30-meter telescope, for anybody that's interested, is at the top portion of the astronomy precinct. Obviously, their contested case process is moving forward. Technically they don't have a permit, so there's no construction activity ongoing or planned until and only if a permit is granted, which there's no set time frame for a decision either way on any of that. Otherwise, the main point of this slide and the next one is to point out that under the decommissioning plan, and then subsequently with Governor Ige's May 2015 proclamation sort of reaffirming that, other than the TMT site, there will be no new areas developed for astronomy purposes on Mauna Kea. And furthermore, any previously undisturbed areas of cinder cones are not going to be disturbed in the future. And they're both cultural and natural resource reasons for those decisions. So basically, you know, the spaces in what's sometimes referred to as poi bowl, sort of the center of the summit cluster of cinder cones that's cinder right now and it's undisturbed, it's going to remain that way. There's the management plans do not allow any future development in those areas. And you can see that in this same photograph here, that the spaces between the observatories are going to remain undeveloped. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Wally for a few minutes to talk about cultural resources before continuing on the natural resources.
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Talk a little bit about the culture on the Mauna. The written language of Hawaii, we didn't have any written language in the beginning. Everything was just verbal by way of olis or chants, dancing, or hula was another form of communicating and documenting historic events. Poems and songs was also a venue with our meles. Mo'olelos was very important. Our historical tales was passed down from generations by way of your storytelling or historical tales. Also very important was our prayers. We would pray for pretty much everything. Permission we had to be acquired in order to enter any type of apua or sites or boundaries. So prayers was important. Another aspect was our answers, receiving answers to our prayers. And Maunakea was Vahipana, sacred storied place of reverence. So this was an area where we would receive and ask for guidance for our people. So Maunakea was a very special place of reverence. Maunakea is central to the Native Hawaiian creation stories, the meeting of Papahanaumoku, our Earth Mother, and our Sky Father, Wakea. Mauna Kea is home to many akuas or deities in our native beliefs. Akua took various forms in nature referred to as kinulaos. We have here a photo of the pools, which was very important. We have a Kukaha'ula, is the summit area. Here we have a photo of the summit of Pu'u Poliahu. She was the snow goddess in our historical tales. Pu'u Waiao is where our lake is located. Again, a very special place, along with Pu'u Lilinoi. And all of these goddesses were all water forms of our Hawaiian goddesses. So that's how important the water was. Without water, there was no life. So most of the major pools on the mountain like this were all after water gods. So the entire mountain is deeply connected to our native Hawaiian legends and to our spiritual beliefs. There's also sites of hundreds of significant archaeological sites and historic properties, which we just started again surveying and checking all of our archaeological sites on the Mauna. We do this pretty much every year, different sites at different times. In order to be considered or qualified as a site, historic property, it must be at least 50 years of age. and look much the way it did in the past and be significant. This is a photo of all of our historic properties that is documented with the State Historical Preservation. And these are the sites that we monitor throughout the year. All of these triangles is a certified site that is a little over 300 in count. And we have just as many find spots. Find spots are sites that are less than 50 years of age. And it's throughout the area also. This is a photo of one of our adze quarries. This is a very important resources that the Hawaiians mine to create a very fine tool for carving and to cut down trees and hollow out canoes. You would use a hammerstone like this that would use to chip away at these adze blanks, where they would create adze to help as tools. But this adze blank was carved out of there with the hammerstones and brought down to lower elevations to be polished and attached to handles. And this was used as axes. Here we have a shrine, an upright shrine. And these are physical manifestations of a spiritual deity that was assigned to the family who worked up on the Mauna. And there were house sites up there, or at least safe shelters where these shrines were nearby. Also up on the Mauna, you would find trail markers or memorial sites commemorating special events that took place, such as our queens going up for cleansing up in Lake Waiau. Also, trail markers would mark a route that you would walk on a trail to maintain your direction as you traverse the mountain. In ongoing cultural practices, we have free access for your cultural practices as long as the road is open due to not being blocked by the snow. But we have access for cultural practitioners that are able to go up as needed to practice their free without being harassed or bothered in any way. So it is specific sites like the Lake Waiau is very special to us. And yeah, they can go up at any time as long as the road is open. For kupus or offerings are allowed to stay up there for 10 days or 2 weeks. These are, as long as there's no food products or some type of advertisements, a lot of them leave their business cards in the area visited by our visitors. So that will be removed immediately if they're attracting bugs or any type of advertisement. So 10 days, we remove the whole kupus. If not, it will start to look like a rubbish pile. So here we have our historic building is Halepohaku. This was built back in the 1930s as a shelter for workers or rangers working up on the Mauna region. Turn it back to Fritz, talk a little bit about natural resources.
Switching gears back to natural resources again for a few minutes. Maunakea is considered by the U.S. Geological Survey to be an active volcano, one of 6 active volcanoes in the state. The way they define active for their purposes is from a monitoring perspective, in that it's erupted roughly within the last 10,000 years, and there's the potential, geologically speaking, that there could be an eruption again. There's no indication that it's going to erupt or that it might erupt anytime soon, just that it's geologically a potential to erupt. They monitor it. They also monitor Haleakala as an active volcano, Hualalai, Mauna Loa, Kilauea. I think I'm forgetting one in there. But anyway, Mauna Kea has also been covered by glaciers at least 3 times in the past. You can see evidence of that in this photograph. For example, in the foreground, between the cinder cones, the lava flows are a light whitish color. And that's from the rock at the bottom of the glaciers. You get a rock entrained in the ice, and as that rock scrapes on rock, it scrapes off the dark glossy coating of lava flows, and it leaves behind what looks to us to be a lighter colored lava flow. You can even see how some of that lighter materials pushed up some of the cinder cones, steepened the sides of some of the cinder cones. And then like the first cinder cone in the foreground, the cinder actually naturally erodes down from the top and is starting to rebury that lighter colored lava. So it's not the true height of the glacier anymore, as the cinder naturally erodes back over and reburies what was pushed up on the cinder cone. When Mauna Kea was covered by ice in the past, it also erupted. And as Wally mentioned, there's the Adze Quarry, where the lava came into contact with the ice. It formed this very poetically named, technical term of ice-quenched basalt. And that ice-quenched basalt is a really dense, fine-grained rock type that the Hawaiians figured out was great for making stone tools. And coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the glaciers scraped away some of the softer rock surrounding that, so it exposed some of these really dense veins of rock. And you have in this photograph here in the center is a hammerstone. Above and to the right of that is an adze preform or an adze blade. And sort of in the background are rock flakes. And if you're an archaeologist, it's termed debitage. If this were happening today, we'd call it mine tailings. But really, that's what was happening up in the Adze Quarry portion of Mauna Kea, which is overwhelmingly within the Natural Area Reserve. Part of why the Natural Area Reserve is set aside the way where it is that you have evidence of this rock quarrying that occurred for many years up on Mauna Kea. You also have on Mauna Kea a somewhat unusual feature called self-sorting stone stripes. And this is found in the cinder cone areas, where you have a mix of different unconsolidated material, the ash, the fine cinders, the tephra, the larger cinders. And what happens is any moisture that's in that material most nights of the year, that it'll get below freezing. You'll get little fingers or needles of ice forming that'll lift up and sort that material. And as the ice needles tilt over under the weight of their own weight with the rock that they lift up, and as they melt, it'll over time sort the material into these stripes. This is only really found in other very cold, dry environments where you have the right soil type. Places like northern Canada, Antarctica, things like that. For our purposes, though, what we want to pay attention to is this is a somewhat unusual habitat, even for Mauna Kea. And while if one person were to walk across it, it may not be that big of a deal, and that over time the footprints will get erased. If a group of people walk back and forth, it will rather rapidly crush and compact the cinder to the point where it's not going to recover in any kind of meaningful time frame. And you essentially lose those self-sorting stone stripes and the habitat that it creates. Hydrologically speaking, just a couple of photographs here of Lake Waiau in the Natural Area Reserve, not actually in the university managed lands, but it illustrates it very well. Lake Waiau we were in a very severe drought from beginning in about 2009. By 2012, the lake had all but dried up. They estimate that there was about 3 cubic meters of water in the lake at its minimum. You can see in this photograph in December of 2013. But the only source of water up there, and including into Lake Waiau, the only source of water is precipitation that falls within that pu'u, within that larger cinder cone that it sits in. There's not a groundwater flow from up near the summit or along the road. All the evidence suggests that, this Lake Pu'u Waiau, Pu'u Pohaku, which is another part of the Natural Area Reserve, they have impermeable layers underneath them, and they collect the water that falls within the pu'u, and you have these small lake features. So here in December of 2013, it was about 3 cubic meters of water, but a mere 11 months later, it had filled up with a couple of snowstorms and a tropical rainstorm or two. It had filled up to over 12,000 cubic meters of water and was even overflowing for a while. The lake, we've been in a drought for about a year again now, and lake levels are starting to fall. I had to guess, I'd say it's probably around 10,000 cubic meters of water right now. And we haven't seen a bump from the most recent tropical storm Darby that just came through, but it takes a little time for the water, because the impermeable sediments actually store a little bit of water, and it sort of absorb it, and then they slowly release it, which helps buffer and moderate the lake response. So it takes a little while to see a response if it's not a overwhelming precipitation event up at the summit. Other natural resources that are found on Mauna Kea include things like soundscape. If you think about up at the summit, where there's, seen in some of the other photographs, there's no vegetation, there's no running water, there's no real wildlife to speak of. There's no natural sounds other than the wind in your ears. And that's something that, to the extent that we can, we want to keep it that way. It has both natural and cultural resource values. This photograph is of a endangered Hawaiian honey creeper, the palila. It's the kind of sounds that you often hear pretty much most anywhere else on the planet, bird songs, insect sounds, but up at the summit, you're not going to hear any of that. But the palila, it's a federally protected species. The area around Halepohaku is considered part of its critical habitat, meaning any modification, even pruning vegetation, is potentially considered a take under the Endangered Species Act. So anytime the Mauna Kea Support Services crew needs to prune mamani trees around a stop sign to make sure that people can still see the stop sign, there's a level of surveying and communication with the state that needs to happen. Just something that we all need to be cognizant of. In terms of vegetation, this is a photograph of Halepohaku showing some of the different vegetation or ecological zones on the mountain. There's the subalpine habitat with the Mamani forest that extends up to and just above Halepohaku, and you can sort of pretty clearly see the tree line, if you will, in this photograph. Above the Mamani trees, which are the yellow flowered things in the foreground, you have an alpine shrubland with shrubs including hina, which is a geranium, pukeave, a plant found only in Hawaii, ohelo, related to blueberries or huckleberries, and a variety of other species. But probably the best known plant on Mauna Kea is this individual, the Mauna Kea silversword, or a hina. It's also a federally endangered species protected under the Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that at one point there were less than 50 individuals growing in the wild. But the earliest oral traditions and Paniolo legends, written accounts of explorers climbing Mauna Kea, talk about the mountain not only being white with snow, but the last several miles of climbing to the summit of Mauna Kea, the mountain was carpeted with a blinding carpet of silver swords. So even allowing for a bit of hyperbole on account of the storytellers and authors, it's nothing like that today. If you're assuming most everybody's been up to the summit of Mauna Kea, the only silver swords you will see are ones that people have planted. Today there are about 12,000 silver swords growing. Almost all of those have been planted by state employees, and most of them are on the eastern slopes. So if you go from Halepohaku, there's a jeep road, sometimes referred to as R1 or Skyline Drive. And if you go around to the eastern side of Mauna Kea on that road, you'll see a whole bunch of silver swords planted. And that's also why the state has the fence at about the 8,000 or 8,000 foot elevation level at the boundary between Hawaiian homelands and the Mauna Kea Forest Reserve, is to keep out feral ungulates, both to help palila recovery, which is the primary purpose, but it also helps with a hina or Mauna Kea silversword recovery and grazing from feral goats and sheep, which are the primary cause for why so many of the silverswords have disappeared. So while one thing we found is that the vegetation on Mauna Kea, the species diversity is not that rich above 13,000 feet. We did a vegetation inventory of encompassed all lands above 13,000 feet, and there were only 7 species of native plants found above that elevation. While vegetation's not that diverse, what is really interesting is the insect life that's up there. You have some species that probably people have seen or heard about or have seen similar things before, things like the Hawaiian wolf spider or Lycosa spider. They can get quite large. They live up at the summit. They're down at Halepohaku. We're doing some work to try and better describe the species. There are Agrostis noctuid moths. Up at the summit, they are not active at night. Noctuid means active at night, and they're referred to as noctuid moths. So logically, you would think they'd be active at night, but they're not active at night. They've actually evolved to be active during the day, presumably to be able to survive the cold nighttime temperatures. And for a species that needs a little bit of heat in the air to be able to move around, you don't get it at nighttime. But probably the best known example of an arthropod or an insect on Maunakea is this individual, the vacubug. Circled in red in this photograph, and for scale, that's standing on the head of a housefly, and those yellowish orange flecks on the fly are pollen grains. So the vacubug, its preferred habitat is those unglaciated cinder cones, so those cinder cones that would have been up on the summit of Maunakea that stuck up above the ice cap when it was previously glaciated. The vacubug is it and a closely related species on Mauna Loa, the aa bug, are the only two species in the genus Nicias that are predatory. They're basically scavengers. They feed on other dead and dying insects. All other species in the genus Nicias are seed eaters. That's what Nicias are known of throughout the world. They're cosmopolitan, found on every other continent. And there are other Nicias in Hawaii, and all the other Nicias in Hawaii are seed eaters, including on Mauna Kea. And the vacubug feeds on other insects, basically stuff that gets up at high elevation. It's too cold, too dry, too far from food, falls out of the sky into the cinder cones, and the maybe not dead yet, but the vacubug will come and suck out the bug juices or the hemolymph, the equivalent of blood in the other bugs for a meal. And in this photograph, its mouthpiece is going right into the gap between the fly's eye and skull there. Otherwise, most all the other species on Mauna Kea are introduced, non-native. Things like sheep, goats, cats, reptiles, mongoose, they're all introduced species, things that we don't want on the mountain if at all possible. We are doing some other work to look for other species, but overwhelmingly everything else is introduced, like most everywhere else in Hawaii. But one of the biggest emphases in our natural resource program, at least, is preventing impacts and the introduction of invasive species. Just two examples. One is the plant fireweed, native to Madagascar, believed to come to Hawaii about 30 years ago with cattle feed. It's spread like crazy across the island. It's toxic to cattle in large quantities. Originally, folks didn't necessarily think it would do well up on Mauna Kea because the highest point in Madagascar is about 5,000 feet. Mauna Kea is closer to the top, is closer to 14,000 feet. But it's doing just fine. In the right conditions, it'd even be flowering up at the summit. And it really is changing the habitat, helping create a soil where there was nothing to grow to help create a soil. And the other thing about many of the non-native, especially some of these invasive plants, is they've evolved with ants and aphids, and there are no native ants in Hawaii. And that's a big, whether it's little fire ants that probably everybody has heard about and is concerned about, or if it's Argentine ant, which is also on the island of Hawaii. It's at lower elevation on Mauna Kea. It's in Haleakala National Park up at a fairly high elevation, so we know it can live in high elevations. It's social, it lives in large colonies, it's predatory, it feeds on other insects. And where the Argentine ant comes in, it effectively wipes out the other native insects. And in 5-10 years, there are no native insects around to pollinate the native plants. So all of a sudden, you don't have much in the way of native plants reproducing either. There are no ants above Halepohaku on Mauna Kea. There's one species that lives, it's pretty pervasive. It's in the road gravel all the way down to the Saddle Road Junction on the Mauna Road in Hakalau National Wildlife Refuge. It's in the road gravel and then some of the gravel, and we're not really been able to get rid of it at Halepohaku, but it's not found above Halepohaku, and there are no other ant species, period, either at Halepohaku or above, and that's something we're trying to keep that way. So we have an invasive species plan mandated also by the comprehensive management plan, and really it's sort of the primary focus for our purposes is paying attention to how things move around. Invasive species can move naturally with wind and the animals and so on, and we work with adjacent landowners to try and address that. But what we really focus on is, with all of you, is how movement of people can facilitate movement of invasive species with the tools, with your clothing, with your vehicle, with the material that's getting moved around. The invasive species plan, from a practical perspective, is really about good hygiene. The plan requires that whatever you take up be clean, your footwear, your clothing, your tools. We're not worried about whether or not there's a little grease on a wrench from the last job. It's more the soil, the insects, the plant material that we're worried about. If you see anything that you're not sure about, ideally a photograph is helpful, but even if you don't get a photograph, we still want to know about it. We require that all vehicles be washed before the first use and then again monthly. We know the road's gravel and dusty. We're not worried about the road dust that you get the first time you drive. We're worried about the mud in the wheel wells, the seed underneath the floor, seeds in the floor mats, and so on, things like that. The invasive species plan assigns responsibility to the vehicle operator for both themselves, the vehicle, the cargo, and any of the other occupants. The requirement and expectation is that the vehicle be free of soil, plants, insects. There's also a requirement for inspections by a DLNR approved biologist. Without going into the full technical detail of what needs to be inspected versus what gets is required to be self-inspected by the vehicle operator with every trip. So basically the point being, with every trip, everything gets inspected, but 9 times out of 10, that's by the operator themselves. If it's just a 4-wheel drive pickup truck going up for the day with a few tools, we don't necessarily need to look at it. But to find out more about when a third-party inspection is required, you can go to omkm.org/inspections, and really what that applies to are earth-moving supplies, whether it's shovels or a bulldozer, materials that are stored outside and on the ground. Even one of the observatories a few years ago had an air compressor that we asked to inspect, and it wasn't the air compressor that was the issue, it was the wooden cribbing that was bolted to the air compressor to keep it from grinding on the floor. That was the problem. The compressor, they serviced it and had it in great working order. So it's generally less about the equipment itself and more about the packaging and the crating that it's in. It tends to be a concern. Large vehicles, meaning 3 or more axles, need to be inspected, and large deliveries. Again, you can always contact us or go to the website for more details. Otherwise, just to sort of talk for a couple minutes about best practices to protect all the resources, whether it's the cultural or the natural resources. Again, it's fairly straightforward. Working only in approved areas, not going into undisturbed areas. Only bring up what's needed. Don't litter. Make sure, clean out your vehicle before you come up, so the empty bento box from lunch doesn't blow out and end up turning into litter. Not bringing up any plant material. We don't, for any sort of observatory or permitted operation, we don't allow any kind of plant material other than what you intend to eat as food. Following road signs and other guidance on signs. Not altering the environment, as some of the photos that Wally pointed out. The cultural features, the historic properties can be really hard to identify on the landscape. And just rearranging a few rocks to correct something that looks like maybe it fell down. You could be altering a burial site, especially if it's covered in snow. There's almost no way of knowing what you're moving with. Even if you know where the features are, you can't really figure. It's really confusing and disorienting. And staying in designated areas, staying on roads and trails and so on, to avoid crushing the cinder, creating new trails, and attracting people to areas that were previously undisturbed. Wally talked about the historic properties. There's also something that the State Historic Preservation Division refers to as fine spots. These could be thought of as modern rock arrangements or features that are older that don't otherwise meet the criteria for historic property designation that Wally elaborated on. And the other point about the Conservation District lands, and again, this extends to the Forest Reserve, the Natural Area Reserve, as well as university lands, is in the Conservation District, it's illegal to alter the landscape without a permit, and that includes stacking rocks. In addition, Hawaii law protects historic properties, and it's illegal to alter or disturb the designated recognized historic properties without state approval, again, from the State Historic Preservation Division. When it comes to construction and ground disturbance activities, and this can include something like the 30-meter telescope, assuming they get a permit and proceed, but it also includes decommissioning of a telescope. The Caltech submillimeter observatory, for instance, is working towards decommissioning or removing their facility. Anytime there's ground disturbance, we evaluate the need for archaeological monitoring, and even around some of the existing operating facilities, if they need to level a pad for a crane, for instance, to fix something, we will communicate with the state to just make sure they know about it and verify that no permits required before they level that ground, move the cinder, and even where it's clearly backfill around a foundation that was put in 20 or 30 years ago. In addition, when there is ground disturbance in previously undisturbed areas, a buffer zone will be set up to protect sensitive sites. Typically that's 200 feet, although the exact distance can vary. One somewhat unique aspect about cultural resource law and historic preservation law in Hawaii is that it's illegal to photograph human skeletal remains. The way this was explained to me is that in traditional Hawaiian culture, the iwi, or the bones, possess the power, the spiritual power of that individual, and any physical taking or physical representation of them was a form of capturing that power. So out of respect for traditional culture, it's illegal to photograph remains. This is not going to affect the police in any way, shape, or form. If they need to take photographs, they will take photographs until they feel they have all the evidence they need. There are burials, as Wally mentioned, on Maunakea. If you see bones, we absolutely want to know about it. Please don't take photographs of them, but if you do remember afterwards that you weren't supposed to, it's all right. You can share them with us, report it to us. We'll pass the photographs along to the State Historic Preservation Division and decide what to do. Most likely, or in every case that we've encountered where anyone's observed bones, we'll be going out with them, one of their archaeologists, within a few days to take a look at it and document it and make a determination on the best course of action. Lastly, the law is pretty clear about penalties for violating historic preservation statutes, even more so than some of the natural resource and environmental statutes, but those clearly exist too. As Wally mentioned, Maunakea is also a Navahi Pana, or a sacred site, considered a sacred site. The state has a brochure shown on the screen here. It's available online. It's prepared by the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs and the state parks and other organizations. But really, it talks about the best practices for what to do around sacred sites. And its recommendation is a moment of quiet, respectful contemplation is the best thing. Not leaving physical offerings unless you know what you're bringing up is appropriate, something that whoever manages the site thinks is appropriate, and they're prepared to take care of it. So our request and recommendation is a moment of quiet contemplation to think about why you're there, what you're going to do there, and how you can respect the past and the present while you're there. And just to sort of wrap up here for a couple minutes to talk about safety. This is a photograph from a couple years ago, a couple on their honeymoon. I think this was an all-wheel drive rental vehicle. They drove up to the summit, the car, were taking some pictures, smelled something funny, turned around, and their car was on fire. They were able to grab most of their stuff out from within it, but there wasn't anything left to speak of the car when everything was said and done. Presumably an electrical or an oil type fire got started. For anything that's permitted on Maunakea, meaning the observatories, the vendors, the contractors, the tour companies, we require use of a four-wheel drive vehicle. They follow the speed limit signs and other road signs. It helps keep the dust down, keeps everybody safe. Four-wheel drive low on the way up. Not just have a four-wheel drive vehicle, but have it in four-wheel drive above Halepohaku on the way up. That circulates the transmission fluid and helps keep your transmission from overheating. On the way down, it saves your brakes for when you really need them. Pay attention to the altitude. I think all the observatories and tour companies have much more thorough safety programs than what we talk about here, but we have more safety information if anybody wants it. The elevation is this latitude, it's very dry. The elevation causes you to lose liquids naturally too. So drink lots of fluids. Stop at Halepohaku, that 9,000 foot elevation level, for at least 30 minutes to acclimate. Essentially almost everybody's coming from sea level and wanting to go to 14,000 feet within the day. That's not, if you're in Colorado and going from Denver up to a summit, to a 14,000 foot summit, you're starting at closer to 9,000 feet. You've already been acclimating. And pay attention to how the body reacts. Everybody reacts differently, and it's not necessarily consistent from day to day. Some people will get slow, lethargic, tired, headaches, nauseous. Other people will become aggressive or angry. It differs from person to person and even from day to day. So pay attention to yourself and those that you're with. Pay attention to the weather. The Maunakea Weather Center, it's available online. It's public. They issue a forecast every morning and every evening on all weekdays. It's actually a really accurate forecast for the summit. Lots of webcams to help prepare you for the day, what current conditions are, what to expect. By all means, ask the rangers up on the mountain for help. That's what they're there for. But in case of emergency, you probably have heard that cell phones are not allowed within the Maunakea Science Reserve, basically that paved road section and up. In case of emergency, use your phone, call 911, get the system started. Reception is spotty up near the summit, but if you can find reception and if it's medical or a vehicle or a fire, call 911, make sure the police and the ambulance or the fire department know about it, and then by all means reach out to the rangers for help. That's what they're there for. That's what they spend a lot of time and effort training, communicating with the different emergency response services for how they can facilitate, whether it's patient stabilization or transport or traffic control or whatever the case may be. But again, please call 911 in case of emergency. And lastly, just to wrap things up here, if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach our office. I'm not very good with numbers, but they're up there on the screen. If you need to reach us by email, it's at omkm@hawaii.edu. Our website, the easiest way to remember that is omkm.org. The rangers are up on the mountain. If you have an emergency, please call 911. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attending today.